A critical moment in the campaign, a sitting and a former president facing off, hoping to win the office.
You're the sucker. You're the loser.
He should apologize to me right now.
The stance each candidate is taking and what it means for Texas.
Our mission, number one, is to end gun violence, period.
The country's top doctor has declared gun violence a public health crisis, what the U.S. Surgeon General recommends, and the work already being done in Texas.
Our letter is asking the Biden administration to change course and to start including Texas.
Connecting the grid, the latest push from congressmen in Capitol Hill to keep the lights on in Texas during an emergency.
Produced from the Capitol in Austin and airing statewide, this is the award-winning State of Texas.
Our top story, former Uvalde School District Police Chief Pete Arredondo turned himself in this week and was booked on 10 counts of child abandonment and endangerment. A former school police officer, Adrian Gonzales, faces the same charges. According to a House Investigative Committee report, Gonzales was one of the first officers to enter Robb Elementary the day 19 children and 2 teachers were killed in a mass shooting. The indictments for Arredondo and Gonzales are the first charges since the deadly shooting at Robb Elementary 2 years ago. Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm Josh Hinkle. Here in the studio with us now is Ryan Chandler, who is following this story. Ryan, what have you uncovered here?
Well, here's the indictment, and what we know is that the grand jury, after months of hearing evidence, has indicted both Arredondo and Gonzales with 10 counts of abandoning and endangering children. Essentially, what they are arguing is that Arredondo's failure to identify the situation as an active shooting, his failure to respond as he was trained to do, and the delays in their response were not just incompetence, they were incriminating. This goes beyond just a failure to do your job and has actually escalated to a criminal offense.
How do the families of the victims feel about the arrests?
It's not enough. It's not enough for them. There were almost 400 police officers who responded to Robb Elementary that day. This is a step toward accountability for 2 of them. But when you ask them, they say that this is not about putting people in jail. What they are calling for is systematic structural reform to make sure that the tragedy that they are continuing to endure does not happen to any other families. They're calling for legislative change in terms of gun policy, raising the age to buy an assault weapon to 21. Putting in place safe gun storage rules and universal background checks. They're calling for all of the officers who responded that day to resign or face more accountability. This is certainly welcome news for them, but it is not the end of their calls for justice.
Yeah, where do we go from here?
Well, I mentioned 376 police officers responded that day. 92 of them were with the Texas Department of Public Safety. The families are leading a lawsuit against every single DPS trooper who was on the scene, suing them in their personal capacity for these same allegations of incompetence and a dereliction of duty that day, calling for civil damages from each one of them. There's also continued calls again for political change next legislative session to try and keep the memories of their children alive through change, not just through criminal proceedings, but through real societal change. These families, despite being happy with what is happening here, are not going away anytime soon in their calls for accountability.
All right, Ryan, we know you'll be watching this closely. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
After almost 5 months of oral arguments, the Texas Supreme Court upheld a law banning certain treatment options for transgender minors in the state. The majority opinion stated Senate Bill 14 does not violate the Texas Constitution and that state lawmakers have the right to regulate the medical field. A group of families, doctors, and LGBTQ+ advocates sued the state to block the law from taking effect and expressed their disappointment at the court's decision. The law remains in effect and bars young people from receiving puberty-blocking medication, hormone therapies, or surgeries to assist in their transition. Attorney General Ken Paxton said his office will work to make sure doctors are following the law. Last year's regular legislative session saw a record number of proposals introduced that would affect the state's LGBTQ+ population. Investigator Arzo Dos took a deep dive into Senate Bill 14. Look for it on our website this week in our State of Texas story. A rematch 4 years in the making. President Biden and former President Trump faced off in the first debate of this election cycle in Atlanta, Georgia.
We are living right now in a rat's nest, and because of his ridiculous, insane, and very stupid policies, people are coming in.
And if I'm elected, I'm going to restore Roe v. Wade. He was the worst in all of American history.
If he wins this election, our country doesn't have a chance.
The fallout only the beginning from a debate that could help shape this race.
And we're back with more campaign context, fresh off the first debate of the 2024 presidential cycle. President Biden and former President Trump going head-to-head in Atlanta. Before the debate, a new Biden campaign ad really went there and called Trump a convicted criminal after Trump's recent felony hush money conviction in New York. And Biden brought that up again during the debate. But as for whether this even resonates with voters, we look to this month's fresh polling numbers from the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas, which showed 50% of Republicans say Trump's conviction makes them much more likely to support him in the 2024 presidential election. Now, for some context on that, we went straight to one of the researchers behind the poll, James Henson.
I think a lot of this is what we would call confirmation, or a kind of a means of social expression rather than an indication that anybody's minds have changed. Most people out there, particularly Republicans and Democrats, know what they think about Donald Trump.
The poll also found Trump's favorability ratings went up a few points among Republicans compared to this time last year, and his disapproval ratings went up among Democrats and independents. But Henson points out all of that movement is still within the margin of error, so not a lot of people changing their minds at this point in the race. Look for more campaign context headed your way as election season rolls on.
Joining us is Niall Stanage, White House columnist for The Hill. Thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
So after the debate, some Democrats called for Biden to step aside. How serious are those conversations, and could that actually be done?
They are very serious conversations because by any measure, this was a pretty disastrous debate for President Biden. It really put a sharp point on all the existing concerns about his age and his mental acuity. Now, he has the Democratic nomination if he wants it, because of course he won overwhelming victories in the primaries. The question is whether he could be persuaded to step aside. And that seems doubtful. It's possible, but doubtful. It would have to be a voluntary decision on his part.
Now, the latest polls from the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas show 50% of Republicans say Trump's conviction makes them much more likely to support him. During the debate, President Biden kept bringing up his conviction. Is this the strategy from his campaign to get votes, and is it working?
Well, what we know from the polls is that President Biden appears to lag nationally by about a percentage point and is behind in most of the swing states. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that is a bad argument that you have just outlined, because of course it doesn't just depend on Republicans. It could be that that argument has some traction with independent voters, with people in the middle ground. I would say, though, the lack of vigor in President Biden's debate performance rendered many of his arguments pretty ineffective.
Polling shows that Texans don't believe Biden is doing enough to deal with the immigration issue. Was there anything in the debate that could change their mind, in your opinion?
I don't think so, and I don't say that to beat up on the president. Immigration, we know, is basically his weakest issue, not just in Texas, but across the nation. And he didn't really make a particularly strong case for changing people's mind in that regard in the debate. Now, the kind of rhetoric we heard from former President Trump was the kind of rhetoric he often uses about the border and about migrants. Some people like that. It turns others off. But your question is really about, was there a game changer on the immigration issue? And I certainly didn't see one.
All right, Niall Stanage, White House columnist for The Hill. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Gun violence has now become the leading cause of death among kids and teens. And that was not true a decade ago or 2 decades ago.
The recommendations from the U.S. Surgeon General to end gun violence, a deep dive into one of those ideas and what a public health crisis means in Washington, D.C.
We've had an electric grid with a Texas-shaped donut hole in it for the longest period of time.
a push to keep the lights on in Texas. One congressman is calling on the Biden administration to take action. Hear his plan this summer to prevent blackouts. Connecting the grid. In 2021, freezing temperatures plunged millions of Texans into darkness. With no heat, pipes and homes burst, and temperatures were in the single digits. Hundreds died. The blackout lasted days. The power grid was only minutes away from completely collapsing. As the heat ramps up this summer, there are growing concerns about the reliability of our state's grid and the prospect of rolling blackouts. So what will it take to keep the state out of the dark? Congressman Greg Casar, joined by 21 other members of Congress, sent a letter urging the Biden administration's Department of Energy to build transmission lines between ERCOT and national electric grids. Will Dupree sat down with the representative to understand his plan.
You and some colleagues sent a letter to the Department of Energy focused on electric reliability here in Texas. What was the intent of that letter? What would you like to see that agency do?
We need to interconnect the Texas grid. A recent MIT study showed that by fully interconnecting Texas to the national grids, basically catching up to the 21st century, we could have prevented 80% of the blackouts that we suffered during Winter Storm Uri. We could prevent blackouts that we might be facing in a hot summer like this one. And so we need more electric transmission, that is, electric lines that pull energy in and out of Texas. Our letter is asking the Biden administration to change course and to start including Texas in our electric transmission planning. It's just basically been that we've had an electric grid with a Texas-shaped donut hole in it for the longest period of time. And I think it's time for the Biden administration and for the state of Texas to change course and start building electric lines in and out of the state.
Is there any answer just yet from the Department of Energy or anyone from the Biden administration?
In a committee hearing just a few weeks ago, I asked the Secretary of Energy, so the highest ranking energy official in the Biden administration, what it was she thought about interconnecting the Texas grid. And she pointed to Winter Storm Uri as the perfect example of why we need that kind of interconnection. And so I'm looking forward to working with the Biden administration on this issue. I think that they've been real leaders on energy issues, and I think they'll be leaders here. And so I'm looking forward to a positive response from them. If we get a yes answer from the Biden administration, which I hope and expect we will, that'll open up billions of dollars in potential financing for electric transmission lines in and out of Texas. And even if we just build up electric transmission around the state, it'll make it easier for us to hook into that. And we'll be able to use that in times of extreme need because it's really hot or really cold.
Along with this letter to the Biden administration, Congressman Casar co-sponsored the Connect the Grid Act. It would require ERCOT to connect to the nation's two major power grids. Some Republicans, including Randy Weber of Texas, opposed the bill, saying that the national grid had its own challenges. At this point, the bill has only been referred to the Subcommittee on Energy, Climate, and Grid Security. So why does Texas have its own electric grid? When Congress passed the Federal Power Act in 1935, it gave the federal government authority to regulate the transfer of electricity between states. Utility companies in Texas came to an agreement that they would not send any power out of the state. In 1965, after a national power outage, new federal regulations were introduced to create councils focused on electric reliability. That's when the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, was created. In 1996, under then Governor George W. Bush, ERCOT became the country's first independent system operator with the goal to provide lower prices to customers throughout the state.
They're not exempt from the pitfalls of humanity or other corporate greed.
Managing two operating rooms simultaneously, leaving critical portions of surgeries to residents. The hospital at the center of a $15 million settlement.
They're putting themselves in between two people sometimes that want to harm each other with guns.
And the U.S. government's top doctor declares gun violence a public health crisis. The changes that could be on the horizon. A public health crisis. The U.S. Surgeon General made the declaration on gun violence this week. Dr. Vivek Murthy warns the epidemic not only impacts victims of gun violence, but also the mental health of our country as a whole. It's driven by the growing number of injuries and deaths involving guns in the country. Washington correspondent Jesse Turnure shows us the recommendations made by the country's top doctor.
This type of advisory can help shift the course of public health history, most notably when it raised awareness about the dangers of smoking tobacco. And Dr. Murthy tells me that's what he's hoping for here.
Gun violence is a public health issue.
That's the new advisory the nation's top doctor issued Tuesday that aims to reduce gun violence across the U.S.
Gun violence has now become the leading cause of death among kids and teens. And that was not true a decade ago or 2 decades ago.
Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy says the advisory not only focuses on the deaths and injuries involving firearms, but also the ripple effects.
Those reverberating traumas have taken a toll on the mental health of our country.
Murthy says public health advisories can make a difference, pointing to the 1964 Surgeon General report about the dangers of smoking tobacco.
It ultimately dramatically dropped smoking rates from 42% in 1964 to under 12% today.
Murthy's advisory on gun violence proposes a ban on automatic rifles, universal background checks, and penalties for people who do not safely store their firearms. The National Rifle Association quickly condemned the advisory, saying, "This is an extension of the Biden administration's war on law-abiding gun owners. America has a crime problem caused by criminals."
We need Congress to keep pushing for and passing new legislation.
But Robb Wilcox with the White House's new Office of Gun Violence Prevention says the advisory should push lawmakers to put partisan politics aside,
so that we can keep saving lives in this country.
And Murthy tells me in the absence of action at the federal level, state lawmakers, even community organizations and schools could adopt some of his recommendations. In Washington, I'm Jessie Chnor.
The U.S. Surgeon General's announcement came with policy recommendations that will never pass a divided Congress, like banning the sale of weapons like the AR-15. But he also shared other ideas about prevention, including early intervention. Will Dupree looked at how those programs are already at work in Texas.
Gun violence recently hit close to home, devastating the loved ones of those killed in Round Rock.
Now my family is left with a void.
It hurts, it does, but I'm getting through.
This tragedy underscores the work to prevent deadly shootings.
We're seeing the rise in violent crimes involving guns, and it is our job to respond to those trends.
Shayna Fox leads the Council on At-Risk Youth, a nonprofit that held more than 1,800 students in Central Texas this year with skills to avoid violence and crime.
We are a school-based mental health program where we do individual and group counseling, and we are at 20 schools around Central Texas.
Early intervention like this is part of the recommendations from the U.S. Surgeon General.
Firearm violence is a public health crisis.
Along with community violence prevention programs like ATX Peace.
Our mission, number one, is to end gun violence, period. Now, the way that we do that is that we have violence interrupters.
They're putting themselves in between two people sometimes that want to harm each other with guns.
Since starting almost 2 years ago, ATX Peace says it helps stop at least 15 retaliatory shootings from happening. It, along with other groups, credit money from the city and county for helping grow their work, and they're counting on the Surgeon General's latest announcement to boost that support in the next budget process.
We need more funding to continue to support the efforts that we have already in place.
Will Dupree, State of Texas.
If it's happening at a reputable hospital, what do you think's going on at your community hospital?
Your life in the hands of someone who is in training. The lawsuit filed against heart surgeons in Texas, accused of leaving medical residents alone during procedures. Left unqualified, 3 prominent Baylor heart surgeons in Houston are being accused of medical malpractice, according to new allegations from the FBI. A newly unsealed lawsuit alleges the cardiac surgeons left medical residents alone in operating rooms so that they could go to do other surgeries at the same time in order to get paid more. Monica Madden has been digging into the lawsuit.
On Monday, the feds revealed allegations that these heart surgeons would work on 2 or even 3 surgeries all at the same time with the approval of Baylor St. Luke's Medical Center. It is home to one of the top-ranked heart hospitals in Texas.
If it's happening at a reputable hospital, what do you think's going on at your community hospital?
Luke Metzler, a medical malpractice attorney in Dallas, says his firm is currently vetting calls from other Texans who might have been harmed by this alleged malpractice.
This is an important issue because it goes to the accountability of healthcare providers and healthcare institutions in general.
According to court documents, the alleged scheme spanned from 2013 to 2020, including thousands of surgeries where residents were left alone in the operating room without supervision and without the patient's knowledge.
The residents and fellows are still learning and need somebody that has the experience and qualifications to ensure that safe, appropriate care is going on. There are multiple different levels of oversight that would have been aware of that.
The lawsuit says the doctors performed more than 5,000 overlapping surgeries, boosting hospital revenue by $150 million and therefore incorrectly billing Medicaid. The doctors also got compensated more for a higher volume of surgeries.
They're not exempt from the pitfalls of humanity or other corporate greed.
Baylor College of Medicine and its affiliates agreed to pay a $15 million settlement to the federal government to address the Medicaid claims in the case. Criminal charges were dismissed as part of the agreement. None of the defendants admitted guilt. Monica Madden, back to you.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. We'll be back next week to bring you an in-depth look at Texas politics.